Okay. And we're live.
Yay.
Hi, everyone. Lisa from SheisMe. I'm back. We've been here for quite a bit today with a lot of speakers. Right now, we're being joined by Jasmin Faulk-Dickerson. Hi, Jasmin.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Why don't we start out with you telling everybody who you are, what you do, and why you're with us?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Jasmine, and so a little bit about my story because it's a little eclectic. I am an immigrant, and I'm always very proud to share that piece. I'm an immigrant with two very diverse cultural backgrounds. My mom is Italian, born and raised in Italy from Florence, and my dad is Arab from Saudi Arabia, also born and raised. My parents met in the 1960s, back in a time when things were a little more, I don't know, different than now. Traveling and especially those cross-cultural experiences were really unique. They got married in the late 1960s, moved to Saudi Arabia, decided to have their family there. And so I am the product of the first generation of bicultural kids in Saudi Arabia, because the country's was founded in the late 1930s. So this was kind of a unique time. And I grew up there sort of as an experimental child, especially as a young girl and turning into a woman from two very diverse backgrounds in a really different culture, a really kind of oppressed for women, and definitely a lot more traditional and conservative with practices that are not in alignment with maybe liberation of feminist movement. And so for me it was really challenging growing up there, and in my mid-20s I decided I needed to take ownership of my own life and my own trajectory, and decided to escape basically. And my story is very long and vast, and there's places in which I've shared it. I've also written a memoir. But basically, I came here to the United States in 1999. And for the past 25 years, my life has been somewhat organically, somewhat, by choice, but a lot of it also not by choice, been thrust into the world of advocacy. And so a lot of what I do is really advocating primarily for women's voices, but also just sort of aligning cross-cultural understanding, working with identity, making sure that we're creating those bridges to really understand each other a little more. How do we find our voices, and how do we really sit into the authenticity of ourselves? So that's just kind of a very quick taste of what I do and where I came from.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely wonderful. Um, so what well, you kind of touched on this a little bit about what inspired you to tell your story. Um, because you
Yeah.
wrote your book, and I want to know a little bit more about that. Like, what was the inspiration to really tell your story and get it out there?
Sure. Yeah, that's actually an interesting uh, an interesting way in which I came to this. Because when I first arrived here, I was kind of hoping to leave my entire past behind me. I really didn't want to relive it or talk about it or bring it to the forefront, simply because these were different times. There was definitely a little bit of shame and discomfort with it. There was also a lot of fear with addressing it and talking about it. And so for a while there, I thought I was just going to put it all behind me, live this kind of new life, build it all from scratch. And for a couple of years, I was able to do that. But then 9/11 happened, and as devastating as that tragedy was for those who were impacted by it, it was also a really difficult time for immigrants and people from the Middle East living in the West. And in no way am I comparing how difficult that was to me to the tragedy of the victims and their families. But culturally, there was kind of this sense of pressure that I felt to be a little more vocal, to explain a little more. The broad brush that was painted about people from the Middle East was getting lost in that pain and in that trauma. And so I was kind of pulled somewhat forcefully by the community around me to have a little bit of a better understanding of it. And I found that there was a sense of empowerment for me in telling the stories, and also in being able to help others understand them a little better. And so that's kind of how I started being a little more open and vocal. But then obviously with maturity and with growth and becoming a mother and being a member of community and just being a natural public servant and advocate myself, I felt like there was this sense of responsibility in telling the story. So that's kind of how I got into it. But then as I continued this work, I realized that there's also a lot of concern with erasing parts of history and kind of burying some of the truths and some of the experiences, especially of women in certain parts of the world, because there's a lot of opening and modernization happening in the Middle East currently, and
Mhm.
and it's great. It's wonderful that that's happening, but it's also happening at the cost at times of pretending like some of the issues and some of the traumas that women of my
Right.
generation experienced are not necessarily, something we want to talk about. And I think that documenting history is super important.
I agree. I agree. And we need to talk about it, and we need to tell those stories so that we don't repeat them,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And that's something that we need to stay aware of, and why it's so important that history be accurate when we convey it, and not just hide it, cover it up, pretend it didn't happen, any of those things, because um, we need to be aware.
Yeah.
Our children need to be aware.
Mhm.
Um, it's so important with any culture, with any history, and some countries are going back to the past and thinking it's fine. What's happening in Afghanistan and some of the other countries, and where some of the politicians in this country want to take
Yeah.
the world, back with their Project 2025, which is completely frightening. So it's really important that we do talk about it, and that we do um, tell our stories, and tell our history, and tell what has happened in truth.
Agreed.
Um, yeah, yeah, I'm all for it, Jasmine.
Mhm.
So what is that key? What is the key takeaway that you would like women who listen to your talk to have?
Yeah, I'm really excited. First of all, I love everything that She Is Me stands for. I think that women, let me just preface by saying I think that women at the moment right now in history are really hitting a very challenging um, time, in part because the feminist movement tends to go just as far and then it kind of halts and something happens that really breaks that ability to continue to reach that ultimate goal, right? And the goal is not for us to, override anything or anyone or squash any movement or take up too much space or more space than needed. It's really just to find that sense of community and our place at the table, right? And so
Yes,
that includes working with men, that includes working with the LGBTQ community, that includes working cross cultural and cross racial identities. And so for me, it's been really challenging to find spaces where I can only talk about women's issues with women. It seems like there is a need for excessive inclusion that oftentimes takes upon and infringes upon women's ability to just be in spaces and really talk vulnerably or powerfully about our issues. And so that's why I'm really excited that you exist, that the conference exists, and there's a space for that. And so my workshop that I've already offered a couple of times is called Uncensored Women. And the hopeful takeaway from that is really finding through our own stories how we can really reclaim our voices, reclaim our power, and really uncensor what has been a historic imposition on women and their voices all over the world. And
yes,
so we have naturally been censored, whether it's from places where I come from, where the censorship is blatant, or cultures like ours in the West, where it's a very subtle and kind of unspoken censorship. And so that's the goal. My hope is that we can see the commonality of our stories, things that bring us together just by default of being women in this society. And then how do we, reclaim our voices and our power?
that's amazing. You're just right on it. And I agree. We always seem to get so far, and then there's this screeching halt, and I don't know, I can't put my finger on it. I mean, I've done a lot of work around that, and I can't put my finger on it, but I feel like we really have some traction right now. And you're right, it's a difficult time for us, but if you just take a step back and look at the big picture, you can see all of the patriarchal structures just crumbling around us, and how we're all like, we can't give up now. We have to keep
Mhm.
going. And again, it's not to replace or take somebody else's space or voice or anything like that. It's just for us to actually be able to have a voice, and to have our rights, and to be recognized as human beings, equal
Yeah.
across the world, right?
Mhm.
So that's why She Is Me exists as well, virtually. A lot of people always ask me about, do we do things in person? Or, well, yes, but we have to gather here in order for everyone to have access.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Agree. Yeah.
So no matter where you are, you can have access. And with you coming from Saudi Arabia, that's now the 34th country represented on the SheisMe platform in the last 5
Yay.
years. So
Woohoo.
we're trying to give a voice to every woman from every corner of the globe so that we are aware of what's happening. We do know that women exist in these places who want what we want, you
Yeah.
know. So it's not just a movement here in the United States, right? It is a
Absolutely.
global realization and movement that we are now rising up to take our rightful space in the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I absolutely love that. I validate that. I embrace that. And it is very true because women's experiences are so different around the world. And we tend to forget that in the little bubble that we live in here. So I really appreciate that, Lisa.
Yeah. I mean, they are different, but they're the same at the same
Sure.
time, right? We grow up, we're told we need to be mothers. We're told we need to, submit and behave and smile and be quiet. And it happens everywhere, no matter where.
Yeah.
It's changing. It's changing. We're changing it. We're doing the work here. So thank you for joining us so
Of
much.
course. My pleasure.
And besides what you've told us about you already, is there anything that you can share with everyone, something that we should know about you?
Well, I'm open to any conversation. So I think that's one of the things I really try to emphasize in any opportunity that I have, whether I'm doing talks, workshops, or engaging in organizations or on one-on-ones, is that for me there is no topic that is off topic. And part of the reason why is because that censorship, I think, is the one thing that scares me more than anything right now in society. That's not just for us as women and our voices, but also cross-cultural and on across the political line, across the religious line, just the social line in general. I don't think that wanting to be righteous is problematic because it does put us in this situation where we then, silence other people's voices. And honestly, even if people are saying things that are unacceptable, in that mistake and the dialogue and permission for that, I think growth and learning happens. But if we
Yes.
don't allow for those mistakes to happen, honestly, I think that kind of tension and that kind of anger will just fester and grow. And so I am an open book. I welcome any controversial conversation. I, in fact, lead them oftentimes. And so that's definitely something that I hope, folks who will engage with me, whether through the She Is Me movement or any other way, that they know that I welcome any conversation.
That's amazing. I'm the same way. Like I'm not afraid at all to touch on whatever conversation you want to have. Let's do it. Let's talk about it. Let's solve some problems. Let's get it out and ask questions. I think that is something that that is terribly censored in our society right now is the women asking questions, right? We're just not allowed to ask questions. We're just supposed to take it. We're just supposed to do what anybody says and take it and never question why, or why is this so important that I take on this role, or that I do this specific thing, or that, like, why is it so important that women are responsible for this thing? Like I'm asking those questions all the time.
Yeah.
And so I encourage everyone who's listening to just ask. If something doesn't feel right, start asking questions. You don't have to be quiet and take it. Ask those questions. Figure it out.
I agree. And I want to add, if possible, and this might be the little trigger and the probably controversial part of my little spiel here, is that I worry that oftentimes this particular pressure is coming more so from the so-called liberated movement. And I say this almost in
Oh,
every
yeah,
talk
yeah,
because I have to preface, I am a liberal. I align myself with a liberal, but that does not mean that I'm not happy to have conversations across the aisle with people who are conservative. I have met a lot of common ground with folks. And as someone from the liberal movement, I can say that I am very disheartened by the level of censorship and closure and erasure and canceling that's happening on the left. And so that, I think, is one of the things that I found myself, especially in the last couple of years, being more and more vocal about and more concerned about. So, and the very fact that us as women also, we need to question our own identity. Is it okay for us to be a woman? Is it okay for us to vocalize being a woman in the midst of gender ideology, which, by the way, there's room for everybody. There's room for the spectrum. That doesn't mean that that spectrum erases our strong, confident, beautiful presence as women and embracing that without being shamed or guilted for it. And that's one thing I'm really passionate about.
right. I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely. And that's an entirely different conversation that we could
Yes,
have and that we
totally.
should have, but maybe that's something that we do on a podcast or something.
Would love that.
Um, and you touched on a little bit, but what was it that made you want to be part of the She Is Me movement?
Oh my gosh, the title alone. I love that. I'm all about unifying with women, all about the mission that you stand for. Honestly, it came to my attention through, I'm trying to think of how it got to me. I want to say a friend of mine must have sent it to me, that I think it popped on her social media. And I recently have been very, very busy with a lot of talks that I've done recently. And so this sort of came up, and I'm constantly saying I'm looking for spaces where I can go and just be with other women and have like safe spaces for women only to talk. And so this came to my attention, and I can't imagine any other better place right now where there's a lot of permission for what I think you and I agree that is really necessary to address. And so I'm beyond excited. I do many talks, I go to many conferences. This is one that I'm really excited about. Maybe you can tell from my social media posts as well, because
Yeah,
I'm
thank
pretty psyched. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Why don't you tell us about your book?
Yeah, so my book is called The Last Sandstorm. It's a memoir that came out a couple of years ago, and it basically addresses my life from birth to the moment that I left Saudi Arabia and came to the United States. And so it's a memoir of that time. And then I always say it's a coming of age story. So even for people who have not lived my very bizarre and unique life, because I know that my story is unique, but our experiences are not. And so I think there is a lot that folks can relate to from their own background, where their own coming of age, or feeling like they didn't belong, or feeling like they were outsiders in their own home or family. So I talk a lot about that and just that kind of personal journey, and give a little bit of context of the culture in that time. And like I said, I know things are changing now, but I think recording history during that time is really important. So that's The Last Sandstorm. It's available on all types of platforms, and in both ebook and paperback.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I can't wait to read it. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you. And
Absolutely.
we just realized we live not too far from one another.
That's right.
So we will definitely have to get together in person and
Look forward to it.
do something. So thank you so much for joining
Of
us
course.
today. Jasmine will be a speaker at the yearly conference. It is the 5th annual She Is Me conference, the 22nd through the 27th of October. And we were also just talking about next year, the conference will be in October as well. But prior to that, we are going to do She Is Me at Sea. And we've got a 5-day cruise from Vancouver, BC to Los Angeles, California. And we are going to have basically She Is Me on board prior to the virtual conference, but we will be live and in person with speakers and workshops and all kinds of stuff. So stay tuned for more news about that. And if you haven't already, sign up for the email list so that you can stay apprised of everything that's coming up. Jasmine, thank you.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you, Lisa.